Welcome to the podcast series at the College of Education and Integrative Studies. I'm Jeff Pass, Dean of the College at Cal Poly Pomona, and we have as our guest today Dr. Teresa Lloro Bedart. Welcome, Teresa.
Hi.
And Teresa is the author of a recent book called Animals in Environmental Education. Teresa, how did the idea for the book come about?
So actually I'm co-editor.
Co-editor.
Of the book,
corrected.
yeah. That's okay.
And the co-editor is?
My co-editor is Valerie Bonchbach,
Okay.
who at the time that we worked on the book was at Roanoke College in Virginia, and she's now at Gustavus Adolphus College, which I believe is in Minnesota.
Minnesota, yeah.
Yeah. So the book actually, and we tell the story in the introduction of the book, actually came out of a conference panel at the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences annual meeting. Valerie was working together with a couple of other folks to organize a panel on teaching about animals or teaching with animals in university contexts. And I had submitted an abstract and ended up being part of the panel. And when we all met, I believe it was in 2016 or 2017, at the conference, Valerie approached me and said, hey, we should do a special issue of a journal. And I said, yeah, we could, or we could also maybe do a book. So at that time, we just sort of exchanged contact information and then began dialogue about, what publisher we might go with and the authors that we would invite. And since my expertise is actually in environmental education, Valerie invited me to be the first editor. So I said, sure. And that's how it came about.
And the purpose of the book, what kind of message are you trying to send?
Okay, so a little bit of history about animals and environmental education. So like all of the social science disciplines, throughout history, the focus has been really on understanding humans, human behavior, human societies, human cultures, whereas animals were left to the natural sciences. Of course, this is in Western disciplines, right? So if we look at other cultures throughout the world and we look at, for example, indigenous societies, the separation of nature and culture is not so entrenched in their ways of being. But in Western cultures, this is sort of the legacy that we have. Around, I would say 10, 15 years ago, there was something called the more than human or the animal turn in the social sciences and humanities. And this sparked a flurry of interest in using the tools of the humanities and the social sciences to understand how humans develop their relationships with nature, with animals, etc. So in environmental education, that sort of scholarship goes all the way back to the mid-90s with folks like Connie Russell and then later Richard Kahn and Helena Pedersen. And with the more recent animal turn in the humanities and social sciences, there really has been a flurry of work in education around what's called the question of the animal. So this idea of sort of how humans relate to animals and specifically in the context of education, what is animal-focused education for? So is it for us or is it for animals? And how do we sort of challenge the anthropocentrism of our field? So this book specifically invited authors who were either themselves working on interdisciplinary projects or sort of cross-collaboration with other scholars who work in different disciplines. So for example, Valerie's chapter is about a course that she taught at her university with a philosophy faculty member, and Valerie herself is a biologist. So that interdisciplinary collaboration was really interesting. So that's where the book is situated.
So what would you say is the relationship of animals to people in environmental education?
That's really a good question, and I think it varies across contexts. I think the work that I do and other scholars like Josh Russell and Johnny Lupinacci and many others, Paulina Rautio, I probably pronounced her name incorrectly, Karen Malone, Lisa Fawcett, we are explicitly sort of asking tough questions about, so if animals are part of environmental education contexts, if they're used in education context, or they're in these contexts, either in a sort of like human-centric setting like an aquarium, or as a reptile in an aquarium in a classroom, or wild animals at a nature center, who is the education? Is the education for the animals or is it for us? And how are they either partners in that educational process, or are they tools or instruments? And
in the past, it's been tools and instruments.
in the past, it's been tools and instruments, right?
So why is it better to include the animals as more like partners?
Well, because if you conceptualize them as tools and instruments, then that sort of objectifies them and allows us to do things to them that we wouldn't necessarily do to another human being. Whereas if we think of them as partners, or even as the term more than human suggests that maybe they're even more than we are, that suggests a different kind of relation, and one that could potentially be less exploitive, right? And all of this is to say that these are really difficult questions, right? And thinking about, well, how do you create an educational context like that? And can you have educational contexts where animals are both instrumentalized, but people are developing compassion and empathy is another really kind of interesting question.
And can you do that?
I don't know.
Has it been tried?
I mean, yes, I would say yes. I would say in my own research at the Aquarium of the Pacific, which I've talked about in a prior podcast, there are people that work at the aquarium, which is a very sort of instrumentalized context. The animals are there on display for human beings.
Entertainment.
And for entertainment. Edutainment is the term that's used. But there are people that work there that definitely develop very, very deep, emotional, empathic relationships with the animals that I think that, and I've demonstrated in my research that the people that visit there cannot, because they come for a very short visit and leave, whereas the people that work there have these sustained relationships. But none of this is to say that even short contact can't have some sort of impact. So, for example, in my chapter in this book and in other things that I've written, published in journal articles, when I've done research on my own courses, I've had students sort of both taking my critical food studies course, where we sort of unpack the idea of animals for food, and students are introduced to the idea of a concentrated animal feeding operation, or slaughterhouses and factory farms, which they're pretty disconnected from, because we're very disconnected from food production.
All we know is for many people, meat comes in a plastic tray at the grocery store.
That's right, yeah. So I've had students enrolled in that class who also simultaneously go visit a local petting farm, and from an hour or 2 hour visit really ask complicated questions about their own positionality in relation to meat. Very small number actually choose to abstain from eating meat after that. Others, engage with these complicated questions, but I don't think resolve anything. So again, not to say that, and the animals at the petting farm where I send them, in some cases, those are animals that are going to be in the freezer. So these are animals that are going to be food animals. So it is a very instrumentalized context, even though it doesn't feel that way to the general visitor observer, because they're not thinking, well, these animals that are on the petting farm at a real actual working farm are going to become food. So there's those kind of complications as well.
So what are some of the other uses of animals in environmental education that have changed over the years? Some of the practices that we've now come to reject or discourage?
I mean, I would say one of the biggest ones, and this is not necessarily related to any scholarship in the field, but a movie, a documentary, Blackfish. I would say that zoos and aquariums have really gotten a lot of pushback from people, because there's been a lot of questions raised about the quality of life for especially large marine mammals that have been held in captivity. And I know, for example, in Canada, I can't remember whether it's banned now, but they're changing the rules about what kinds of animals can be actually held in captivity at aquariums. And so that's really interesting for a lot of reasons. One, because it's quite obvious that there is a speciesism at play there, in the sense that humans tend to identify most readily with other mammals, so other animals that are closest to us biologically. And so we're starting there with, say, whales and dolphins. Questions about whether sharks should be in captivity or small fishes should be in captivity haven't yet been raised, right? But at least what that documentary did, for better or for worse, was sort of visibilize some of the behind-the-scenes practices and problems that are associated with this sort of legacy that we've inherited of zoos and aquariums, which is really a legacy, that is connected to colonialism and imperialism.
How is it connected to that?
Well, because in the United States, and historians, please forgive me if I get any of this wrong. History is not my area. But in the United States, there's a history of going and capturing animals from faraway places and bringing them here, and then keeping them in captivity. And some of this was actually related to bringing nature back into the city, because as cities developed, people began to have anxieties about losing contact with nature. So one of the ways that this was addressed was through the development of the park. Folks like Frederick Law Olmsted,
and developed Central Park and
absolutely
Park
right,
in Boston,
and then
Commons.
Also the development of the zoological park. I wrote actually a book chapter a couple years ago on the role of a small zoo at a soldier's home in Sawtell, which is kind of in the Santa Monica area of Los Angeles, and sort of looked at how the captive animals were used as a tool to socialize vets back into society, right? So there's all of these really interesting newspaper articles where they're writing about the birds singing and the vets, sort of calming down and being brought back into nature and being brought back into society after the trauma that they had endured. So there's this legacy of going and capturing animals and then putting them on display for a variety of different human interests. We have the legacy of circuses as well, which many people in contemporary society are also now rejecting.
And the circuses themselves are eliminating some of their animal acts.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that in the context of education, eventually some of this may filter into classroom spaces where people have sort of kept animals in captivity in classroom spaces without giving a lot of thought to, well, what's in it for the animal? We know what's in it for the kids, but what's actually in it for the animal?
So do you recommend that professors and teachers directly, explicitly address those issues of what's in it for the animal?
I do, but I think it also should be grade level appropriate, and I also think that it needs to be done in a way that that's not so gloom and doom, because environmental education does have that sort of reputation of, embracing the gloom and doom, and then people don't feel empowered to do something different.
Because they see it won't make a difference.
It won't make a difference, right? So I think that, age-appropriate education about these issues is really important. But I do think that, yes, that children need to be challenged to think about, well, what's in it for the animal, because that's not something that we've really thought about.
So some of the ways that animals are used in classrooms is often, the dissecting the frog in the laboratory. As a former high school science teacher, did you have to confront that?
I did, actually, yeah. So I taught high school biology for a while, and I did have my students dissect animals back then, which is interesting because that's now not part of the curriculum. And
by a concerted effort to recognizing the barbarity of it, right?
Right, and I think also just a shift in sort of emphasizing other parts of the curriculum as the field of biology has changed. At least it wasn't when I was in the classroom 8 years ago. That may have changed, but I don't believe that it has. So would I do dissection now? Absolutely not. I think that there's enough simulations and other hands-on simulations that students can use that are sufficient for elementary and high school grades. Those questions, as they carry on to say undergraduate and even medical school, I don't think that I'm prepared to come down on an answer either way, because I think that's more complex.
Right, so using animals for cancer research, for instance.
Yes, yeah.
It's a trade-off.
And I have actually worked at, when I was an undergraduate, I worked at the Loma Linda Lab of Chemical Endocrinology for a summer, and I was taken down to the animal laboratory where they had dogs and primates and other animals, animal testing, and that was really difficult for me. I think that one of the reasons why I didn't actually pursue the sciences in my graduate work was because of that sort of exploitative relationship. It felt that way to me. At the time, I don't think that I fully understood that, But as I've grown as a social sciences scholar, I've really started to realize that that was problematic for me. And again, am I going to come down and say that, that needs to be eliminated? No, I think that these questions are far more complex than a sort of black and white yes or no answer.
So the idea of animals being maybe greater than humans in some species and for some of their abilities is probably threatening to those who subscribe to particular biblical or other religious doctrine. How can we address that in a respectful way?
Ooh, that's a really tough question. I don't know if I'm prepared to answer that question. I'm not a scholar of the Bible. I think that...
Well, let's just talk about it just in terms of resistance, where students are resistant to the idea of, man not being the master of the dominion.
Yeah, I think that young students are actually not resistant to that. I think that a lot of young students sort of see themselves more in community with other species. Of course, kids kill bugs because that's our, natural, instinct, or maybe they've learned it from somebody, you're supposed to kill bugs, right? But I think that it's actually society that socializes them into anthropocentrism. So if we begin at a young age with alternative ways of teaching, then that can extend out to, as we get older, we think differently about that.
So it's providing those early experiences with animals.
Yeah, and with nature more generally. I wrote a paper a few years back on sort of the language in the next generation science standards framework, the framework for K through 12 science education. And I looked at the way that, nature is framed as a resource. And that in itself is really problematic, because if nature, and by extension animals, are just resources, then they're sort of just objects, and they're not entities or organisms or beings in their own right, and then therefore we are authorized to sort of do whatever we want. So I think thinking really carefully about the language that we use, and this is something that eco-justice scholars really pay quite a bit of attention to, is how the language that we use can be really problematic.
So what kinds of language specifically would you want to cite as an example?
Of problematic language?
Mm-hmm.
Well, resources. So when we talk about a forest as a resource, I think that's really problematic. Of course, a forest is a resource, right? But I think that that only referring to it as that conjures in our mind that it's just there for our use. And then when something is just there for human use, then we can just take all that we want without thinking about what the consequences are going to be. Not just for ourselves, right? Because deforestation has consequences for human beings, but it also has consequences for a lot of other organisms. That, some people would say, oh, well, we need those organisms because the ecosystem needs to be balanced. But I would say, well, we also need them because they have an intrinsic value and a right to exist, just as we do. So these are sort of philosophical questions, right, about how we conceptualize our relationships to them.
And your experience as a professor of liberal studies here at Cal Poly Pomona, mm-hmm. Do students embrace that perspective?
I think so. Once we are in class and we start to really unpack some of the language and the terminology, and they learn, for example, what actually goes on in factory farms. And I don't teach just about animal exploitation. I also teach about human exploitation in food systems. So for me, it's very important for students to see that these oppressive systems that we have in place don't just oppress animals or don't just oppress the environment, but they also oppress people specifically along lines of race, class, immigrant status, gender. So we look carefully at, for example, the rights of farm workers, field workers. In fact, they're doing my students in my food studies class are doing a project right now related to that. They've had to select 2 food items, one an animal-based product and one a plant-based product, and investigate what the true price is. And by true price, I don't mean put a dollar sign on it. I mean, what are all the costs to humans, the environment, to animals? And then piggybacking on Teresa Lloro's work in Vermont with farm workers, my students, where she actually used a really innovative research methodology where she had a comic book artist in a room with her or her fellow researchers, interviewing farm workers that worked in dairy farms, pretty much all immigrant farm workers in dairy farms in Vermont, and had the comic book artist actually illustrate what their experiences were. This was used as a form of therapy for the dairy farm workers. But I thought the idea of a comic was really sort of compelling. So my students are creating comics, and they get to pick the audience, whether it's small children or adults. They're creating comics to educate somebody about the true cost of that food item. And so for the animal-based product, of course, they'll be embedding in, some of these questions that are raised in my book, my book and Valerie's book, and in general in the scholarship that I do.
So on the cover of your book, we have ants, and ants and bees are of increasing concern
Yes.
to those who pay attention to the environment and some of the imbalances. Tell us more about why you chose that cover.
It's funny. It's not even actually interesting. As many people who publish know, increasingly publishers are sort of creating these stock covers that you have to choose from. And this was the stock cover. This was the only stock cover that had animals on it. And so we went with that one because we wanted to have an interesting cover with animals on it. But it happened to work out really nicely because Valerie actually does research on ants and bees. So it fit, even though none of the book chapters actually talk about relations with insects. I've actually written a couple of other pieces about relations with insects, but it's not in this book. So.
Well, let's talk about insects for a moment.
Sure.
Insects are viewed as, some people, not as animals because
Right.
They're deemed as unpleasant or
Right.
it's not something you want to look at.
Right.
And then their association with disease. So how do we bring that into a more balanced perspective?
Yeah, I think that, that's a really good question. And these are some of the things that I wrote about and others have written about. Connie Russell and Elizabeth, I'm going to mess up her name. Boy, I don't speak French. Boileau, I think, have written about in a book chapter. Speciesism plays a really significant role in making decisions about which animals we're going to care for and we're going to extend care and empathy to. And insects are usually insects, worms, mollusks, crustaceans. Animals that are not vertebrates are usually on the bottom of the care and the empathy. But I think that, when I had my students working at Center Street Community Garden in Pomona, there were quite a few, actually, that really began to question how they thought about insects, because when they were in the garden, they learned that actually a lot of insects perform critical roles in soil health, and that some insects eliminate other insects that we don't like, which is also interesting to think about, right? And so I had one, and I've written about this, one student who, after taking that class, told me that she used to walk on the sidewalk on top of the roly-polies and just sort of crush them. And after my class, she started walking around them. So I think that there are possibilities for that, but it has to be embedded within, a curriculum where the students learn that animals have value. And of course, this doesn't resolve the question of, there's good insects and bad insects. So we care about the ones that do good work, and we don't care about the ones, like the Asian citrus psyllid, which has caused, millions, if not billions of dollars of damage to the citrus industry, right? So I think, again, these are just really complex questions that don't have neat answers. But I do think that there are folks that are pushing curriculum in the direction of incorporating insects, especially because everybody's really worried about bees right now.
Right. So has the K-12 curriculum changed as a result of the kind of work that you and your colleagues are doing? Not directly.
In the United States, I think it's moving in that direction. I sometimes work with the executive director of the California Science Project, Dr. Maria Simani at UC Riverside. And I know that there is an increasing interest in environmental literacy and environmental justice being incorporated into the K-12 curriculum. In fact, my master's student, Ben Brown, and I have been invited to give a talk to all of the California Science Project directors at a conference at Cal State Northridge, specifically about environmental literacy and about environmental justice. So I think that it's moving very slowly. Unfortunately, in the United States, and it's not like this in other countries, environmental education has been sort of subsumed under a branch of science education, which means that the focus has primarily been incorporating environmental issues into the science curriculum and not into, say, ELA or social studies, which is problematic because then students are getting the scientific viewpoint of environmental issues, but they're not getting the other contributions of the other disciplines.
That's why they need to read my book, which is coming out about how social studies is really the best organ for addressing environmental and
Absolutely.
sustainability issues when you look at politics and law and history and culture.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you said that because in 2006, so I was formerly a high school science teacher, and in 2006 I moved to a new school and was asked to teach AP Environmental Science. And my first year teaching that class, I was like, this is the most amazing course ever because it was so interdisciplinary. I was asked to teach, environmental politics and environmental law, and it inspired me to go get my master's in environmental studies, actually. So I think that I'm hopeful that with the Common Core and the next generation science standards, and really sort of a shift in the way that we think about what constitutes good teaching and learning in K through 12 schools, I'm hopeful that there will be more interdisciplinary teaching, especially in elementary schools where teachers do have that freedom around environmental issues, so that the students will start to this will not only break down problematic disciplinary barriers, I think, but also have the students start to see a more holistic view of how to solve and think about environmental issues, because frankly, science isn't enough.
Right.
I mean, and we know this with climate change, right? I mean,
And what's more, there will be students who come from a social science orientation that can embrace the
Right.
content in ways that they might not have been because they don't like science or they've had bad experiences with science.
absolutely.
So you mentioned interdisciplinary, and that reminds me that you are in a program
Yeah.
called Liberal Studies that emphasizes an interdisciplinary approach. So would you say that your kind of teaching will promote that kind of work when your students, those of them who become elementary school teachers?
I sure hope so. I make a really significant effort to incorporate the arts, the humanities, the natural sciences, and social sciences into my teaching. So, for example, with the comic book project is a perfect example.
Yes, it is.
The students are using an art-based method to convey information about social justice issues, environmental justice issues, and really science content. Because one of the things that I emphasize, there's several things I emphasize in the class. First of all is sort of the some of the issues behind industrialized agriculture and why synthetic fertilizers, for example, how they came about and why they have been beneficial in some ways and negative in many ways. And then the students also bring in some of the effects on communities. So looking at some of the chemicals that end up in water or air and what the side effects of those chemicals are on human bodies and other bodies. So it's this bringing together of lots of different disciplines, right? And then using an art-based technique to convey that information to others. So yeah.
So they can copy that same thing and do it with their students on that and other topics.
Yeah, that's the idea, because we know from the research literature that students who become teachers tend to teach the way that they were taught. So in the liberal studies department, we really work hard to embrace, hands-on, experiential pedagogies. What's really important to me, too, is to try to start with where the students are and then bring them where I want them to be, foundation of critical pedagogy.
And many of our students come from the suburban/urban environment,
Right.
so they might not have as much exposure to nature as maybe a generation or two ago.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I always have students in my classes that are actually like me, who have a parent who immigrated to the United States and worked in agriculture. So it's also a good place to connect to that history with the students because those are histories that typically aren't honored in the K through 12 curriculum. And it's a place to sort of, for the students to be able to relate to those experiences, to relate to the curriculum in a way, because, my dad did this, or my grandfather then came over to the United States through the Bracero program or something like that.
Right. So thank you for joining us today. It's
Sure.
been a fascinating discussion, and the book is called Animals and Environmental Education, and we hope to have you back again in the future with your next project.
Great. Thank you.